Hello. Welcome to the Women Who STEM the Gap podcast, an IIT Delhi and Co-Impact initiative. I am Ridhima Sharma and I'm excited to bring you the insights and experiences of some incredible women in STEM. In this episode, I will be speaking with Dr. Palashi Vaghela, a President's Postdoctoral Scholar at the University of California, San Diego. She holds a PhD in Information Science from Cornell University. You can learn more about her work in the description below. Thank you for agreeing to do this interview, Palashi. Really excited to hear your thoughts. To start off, could you please share a little bit about your STEM journey and what you've been doing after your PhD?
Sure. Thank you for having me. It's so exciting to be in conversation with you and to be part of this project. So I was trained as an engineer in my undergrad, but before that, I think like sciences definitely was one of my favorite sort of subjects in school, both science and math. But there was also a predicament where I really loved literature and humanities. And so the predicament that faces, I mean, probably has evolved over time, but that faced me when I was in school was to pursue how do you pursue both of these together, which I didn't have the answer to at that point of time. So I ended up pursuing engineering and I did my engineering at the Dhirubhai Ambani Institute in Gandhinagar. And once I finished that degree, I was working in Deloitte as a software analyst and a business analyst for about 2 years. And I realized that I wanted to do something different. I mean, I already had this realization slightly when I was in my undergrad, sort of lucky to be exposed to some really brilliant scholars of like social sciences and humanities that were there at that point of time, and some of whom are still there now. And I was introduced to a critical outlook to science and technology through those courses, which really piqued my interest. I was doing really well in them as well. And my undergraduate thesis advisor also kind of recommended that if I wanted to pursue an MPhil, I should. But at that point of time, I just didn't know what to do with that critical perspective in science and tech.
What were some of these courses that you took?
One of them was an introductory anthropological course, which was called Approaches to Indian Society. Another one was like a very intro to science and technology studies, which I know there are different versions of that, even at IIT Delhi and other spaces. Another one was ecologies, and some of them were about modernism and art. So it was kind of supposed to be an elective based setting beyond a point. So first 2 years you had some compulsory courses, which I'm sure a lot of other engineering students would be aware of as well. And like I decided to do my undergraduate thesis also on thinking about how designs of what we use to build an understanding of history or teach history, actually. I was thinking about how history teachers could use certain tools to talk about contentious history. So a particular history of an event could be told from different perspectives. And I was thinking about how we could design an interface or design a technology that could help produce different views of a particular event in history. That was my undergraduate thesis. So by that time, I was already thinking about how the narrative or sort of the context of what we call tech is very much shaped by the society or like moved by the society that we live in and vice versa. But I didn't know what to do with that as a form of living. So once I was working as a software analyst, over time, I realized that I wanted to find concrete ways of bringing those two approaches together. And I came across this organization in Delhi that was doing something that was similar to bringing a feminist approach to thinking about tech. And they had an opening for a ideas and innovation lab that they wanted to sort of hire for. And I applied for it and I got lucky and I got it. But I had no experience working in nonprofit before. I had no experience working in under privileged settings. I wasn't used to working in programmatic settings as well. It was a very different setup. So it was a big learning curve for me. In addition to moving to Delhi and being exposed to the feminist movement in Delhi, it was a very different landscape. And slowly from there, I started becoming even more interested in like exploring the intersection of feminist studies and tech. And what that meant for me was from that job, I went to do another job with a menstrual awareness based startup. And that was also oriented towards doing digital products in that space. And over time, I started figuring out that I'm more interested in figuring out the intersection of how approaches to science and tech, or like our training in science and tech, can come together with trainings in science, in social sciences and humanities. Now, of course, I was trained as an engineer, but I was never trained fully as a social scientist. So I decided to apply for a PhD in a field that was going to be more interdisciplinary, to be able to get best of both worlds, whatever that means. I know it's a very complicated space. And so I didn't apply for a PhD directly. I didn't think I would get in. Actually, I was not a very meritorious student, in the sense that I didn't have like the best grades in my undergrad, and I had like very limited experience in the sort of industry that I wanted to work in, which was like research and academia, or even like doing a setting which brought these two things together. And so I mostly applied for masters, but I only applied for one or two places for a PhD. And somehow I got into information science, which was a really big surprise, because I don't think that I thought the kind of I was kind of going to be able to make it for the kind of work I wanted to do, or I had enough training. The committee I worked with really believed in the sort of vision I had for the project I wanted to do, and they helped me get the training I didn't have. So when I was in my PhD, I was obviously getting trained in more computational approaches, because it was an information science degree, and social scientific approaches, which were to research, which was very much coming from a quantitative bent. But at the same time, because I wanted to specialize in qualitative approaches, I did a lot of coursework outside of information science to get that training. So I spent like almost 4 years doing coursework, which was very unlike a lot of other PhD students. And that helped me bridge that gap that I had. And I was no longer able to confidently claim I'm an engineer anymore, because I was no longer practicing engineering the same way, which was totally fine, because I wanted to do something different. So that has been my journey into PhD. And since defended my dissertation and started this postdoc last year, September, where I'm trying to turn my dissertation into a book, and I'm trying to also venture out into thinking of what are my next projects after my PhD, which continue to be at the intersection of tech and society, and will continue to be in that space. I will pause there, because yeah, I can keep going, but we can, if you have
No, but this is
follow-ups, I can.
very, very exciting. And this is something that is not always, like you said, something that is either encouraged, or that you would find a degree where you can do both social sciences as well as hardcore tech. And now, of course, we have some emerging subfields and interdisciplinary programs which are allowing a lot of us to do
Right.
that kind of work. This is really, really exciting. Can you talk a little bit about your experience at Feminist Approaches to Technology? Because I know that that was one of those pivotal moments where you got into that more of a practitioner space. And did that really change how you looked at tech? And you've talked about how through your training, you've learned and acquired a lot of knowledge and skills across social scientific methods as well as computational methods. But what have been some of, say, experiences outside of coursework in academia that have really shaped your current work as an academic who is working at the intersections of caste, gender, and tech?
Yeah, so FAT was a very interesting turn in my life, as you rightly mentioned, because it was going to take me away from like being in very different STEM spaces to a very different STEM space. I would say both of them are very STEMmy, but in a very different way. What was interesting for me at that point of time was that what I did have skills in, which was the fact that I could understand that there is a need to think about technology beyond just what we do technically, to think about what kind of social construction, what kind of society is it actually going to be embedded in. So that was already there. But what I didn't have skills in, which that was a great place to kind of build that, was to really think about how do you think from a feminist perspective around tech. Now, it was really interesting to bring some sort of training that you have at a very like undergraduate, which is probably a higher level than school. And my job in fact was to kind of work with school going kids who went to government schools and specifically lived in urban settlements in Delhi, to help spark some sort of STEM thinking in them, and tie it to their everyday reality. And it was easier said than done because it was their realities were very systemically tied to oppression and dispossession in ways that are not very familiar to obviously some people based on class privileges, and I'm obviously one of them. But another thing that was really interesting to think about was that it was also made challenging by the fact that while they had this space to explore tech and STEM with us, like the systemic factors were not something that we could totally solve, right? As a nonprofit, as a one person in their life. So the reason I became increasingly interested in thinking about a research approach to this was that I knew that programmatic work was important, but I was feeling that the programmatic work was only one part of the sort of solution, and there needed to be more understanding of how STEM training as well as STEM settings, both in terms of users as well as like people who create these technologies and scientific practices, needed analysis that needed to be coming from the marginalized sections of the society. And that's something that I couldn't do as a practitioner because obviously the practitioner is programmatically engaged and thinking about making these things happen. And so I increasingly became interested in moving away from just doing programmatic work to thinking about research. And that in that sense, like PhD was a good turn for me. And I had enough real life experiences of that was one of them. But then because I was trained as an ethnographer in my PhD and I wanted to do ethnography because of my earlier exposure to anthropology, it really also helped me stay in touch with programmatic efforts, but as an ethnographer, as somebody who could be engaged with people who do run programmatic efforts, including FAT, but other spaces, but also have some sort of distance to think about what else is going on here besides getting the day-to-day engagements done. And that I think has been quite a journey because when I was before my PhD, I didn't have some of the training. And then during my PhD, I got some of the trainings. And every year I used to come to do field work, which is part of the ethnographic model of doing research. And every time I came to do field work, I was realizing that my training or analytical lens was getting sharper, even in the same settings that I was in before, right? Like before I started my PhD. And that was interesting because I think some of the experiences that happened in those fieldwork moments were also being tied to experiences I had had before, but I just didn't have the theoretical or analytical lens of especially caste, because caste was a very unspoken topic, even in Delhi feminist circles. And I guess now it's becoming mainstream because of a lot of movement building by a lot of marginalized caste people. But at that point of time, that was not language that was accessible. And my own caste consciousness was definitely growing through the process of doing the PhD while doing the field work. And so it was almost like the instrument of research was getting sharpened, even though the settings themselves were the same. And that was a very interesting experience for me as well, because my own approach to what I thought was STEM, what I thought STEM spaces were, completely changed and completely evolved from that training. And so that's one of the experiences, and one of the experiences actually I had that happened in the field in my third or fourth year of PhD, and I came to do some summer field work, was actually I was in one place in rural Rajasthan where there was a solar training camp going on with some of the local women and this was very early on. I was trying to figure out where I'm going to do my dissertation work. And so I was just trying to, build relationships and see what settings make sense, what settings even like are accessible to me. And at that point of time, I had this experience where I really changed the way I was thinking about my project, because I entered grad school wanting to focus on feminist technologies from a very like gender and tech focus, because that's what I was working on for a very long time. But in that experience, there was this woman I was talking to, and she was from the same geographical area as I was, but she was married to somebody in that rural Rajasthan area. So we were connected because we were from the same geographic region. And so we spoke the same native language. And she asked me where I'm from, and I asked her where she's from, and all of that happened. And at some point, she posed this question of what are you? And so, like, what are you in a rural setting is very much like, what caste are you, right? Like, it's not like what are you doing for a living kind of a question. I mean, that can still be caste as well. But her question was very much like, oh, what, like, trying to place me in what caste setting I come. I usually in that question, I don't try to I mean, depending on the context, I tried to take very different approaches. But in that moment, I was in a little bit of an experimental mode because obviously I was doing field work. So I was like, let me see what kind of response leads to what kind of outcome. And so I just said that, like I'm from a Vankar community and this is the community I come from. I said it in my native language only. And she nodded and the lunch break was ending. So that was the end of our conversation. Now, before that conversation, we had met once before and she had invited me to come have lunch at her place and, like hang out with her. But after that conversation, I saw her actively avoiding me, like even when we were walking. I mean, it's rural India, so you're going to cross paths very easily. But what was interesting to me in that moment was that she not only managed to ask me my caste location without actually ever uttering the word caste, but at the same time, that completely changed the dynamic of how I was thinking about tech and society, because I was like, this is a nexus that I feel like is determining the dynamics in this space, but it's an unspoken nexus. And so I wanted to make it explicit. And that experience, among others, there were many others, made me realize I wanted to pursue this question more and more. And the more I pursued this question, the more people dissuaded me from, that's a separate conversation. But that was interesting to also observe, because it was interesting to see how people wanted this to be a non-question or continue to let this be a non-question in the setting of STEM. So that was definitely one of the experiences among many others that shaped this turn of work and turn of the perspective I have towards STEM now.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing these stories. Of course, you've shared experiences that have influenced and shaped your thinking to what you're doing right now. Are there any experiences or, say, specific challenges that you faced during this journey that you can think of that you had to tackle or, negotiate with, whether it was moving from a fully like engineering course to then getting into a research space or anything else?
Yeah, I think like there is what you just mentioned is definitely very one of the very big challenges I faced, because I remember first day of grad school or like first week of grad school, we were asked to read like a book a week, which was like this thick. And it was insane because I'd never done that for any of my education before. And it was a very different orientation to sort of studying that I had never had before. I had to almost learn to read again, which was kind of crazy at the age of 25, 26. But in addition to that, I think there were many other challenges that I would say come from doing the kind of work I do in the setting I do it in, right? Like some of it was what you mentioned, like the socioeconomic mobility of some of the marginalized class people is very much tied to some of the aspirational sciences and science and STEM sort of orientation. I wouldn't say it's just for marginalized castes, but I do think that the pressure is higher if you're a very educated marginalized caste person, or if you have access to some of these spaces and if you have access to English, which I know a lot of my family members do. The pressure to do something like that increases even more. So to justify moving away from that possibilities of socioeconomic mobility to do something like this was definitely not easy, and it continues to be a point of contention even now, I would say, within my family, even though they appreciate what I do. Another was sort of a lack of legibility within the Western academia around the kind of work I was doing, right? Which is I wouldn't say that they were like dismissive, but there was like just not enough sense of knowing what I wanted to study meant in some of these settings. And strategically, this kind of became a good thing for me that all my committee members and the people who led me in not all, but the main committee members that I had were non-Indians, non-Savarnas, and which was a really interesting dynamic for me, which I learned about later, the more I talked to marginalized caste people, is that because it definitely let me explore the things that I wanted to without some of the gatekeeping that I know my other colleagues, Dalit scholars, feel. But at the same time, it came with the challenge of not having somebody who really gets it. There was definitely one committee member who studied South Asia and worked in South Asia. So there were those challenges of figuring out how to translate across contexts and continue doing critical work while translating, because sometimes translating becomes the whole job and you don't actually get to make progress around digging deeper into the things that you already know about. So that was one. And finding communities that I was definitely one of the very few people I knew that was working on this topic at that point of time. And that meant that I was very isolated. So finding community, even though it wasn't on this topic, but finding community of people who got it, finding community of other marginalized scholars was definitely a very big learning curve. And the major learning curve was definitely building a critical caste consciousness while being surrounded by very casteless spaces, right? And like having the confidence to assert that caste is an important analytical position to take in this setting, while people continue to ask you, like, how is this relevant to STEM or how is this relevant to tech and things like that. And another challenge that I think personally a lot of critical scholars in STEM feel, and it's not unique to me, but is that this understanding that what we do isn't real science, right? What we do isn't real knowledge making. It's relativistic. It's soft. I hate that word, but that's the kind of term that's understood around critical work of science and tech, even in the computing spaces that I mostly write and work in. And what that does is it makes it sound like this work isn't rigorous enough. And I think that is a challenge that I don't think is going away at any point of time, anytime soon. And one needs to choose very actively where to hang out, right? Like you might get like really brilliant opportunities in settings like computer science departments, but I actively moved away from them because I was like, no, I don't want to be in a space where I have to constantly justify the value of doing this kind of work in STEM spaces. And so I never even applied for a computer science department for anything, even for a single job, even though a lot of my colleagues did. So making those kind of choices has been tough, right? Which means that you have fewer opportunities, but holding your ground despite having fewer opportunities was definitely and it continues to be a challenge. And lastly, I would say just the kind of gaslighting around doing the work you do, sort of protecting yourself, protecting your work, and having trust issues in the academy is a really big one as a marginalized caste scholar. Like it's very hard to feel that you will find a community that values your work for what it is beyond sort of getting tokenized or getting boxed into a particular setting. So that is a challenge that has been there and it continues to be there. And one has to become very ruthless, which is kind of sad, I think, also, but almost necessary to sort of navigate these spaces. But I will say that what has helped through this is finding a really solid sort of network of allies and other scholars. And that is maybe the most amazing thing about having these social media and internet technologies is to have a network, even if you're isolated in that university, in that department. You have some sort of a sense of community that you can rely on, and like believing that some of the things that are happening to you are not just in your head, but finding others that affirm that is also very, and I'm trying to build that more and more into computing spaces as well. We're trying to build an Ambedkarite network of computing scholars, and anybody who's listening to it, if they're interested and if you're from a marginalized caste, please feel free to reach out to me about that. But yeah, so like building these spaces because I felt that I was supported by something like this and I want to continue doing that was definitely helpful. But I'll stop there.
No, these are all really, really important points that you make. I'm just curious about two things. One, is there a place where one can learn about an Ambedkarite network of computing scholars, or is this something that's
Yeah, we're still in the works of sort of putting together something. It's like we just started like a few months back. So for now, I'm trying to set up an email address as someone who tries to do anything at a group level does, but contacting me personally for now is fine, and I can share some details. And otherwise, I can like we're trying to set something up, so you should be able to see something at like the web level soon, but we don't have it yet. So I'm the only person that I'm okay with being visibly associated with it as well. So like there's also a complication around like how many people want to be visibly associated with that. And we're trying to navigate some of those equations, which is why it's taking a little bit longer than any other collective to sort of put together.
And the second thing I was really curious about is that you said that, you actively avoided applying to computer science departments for jobs. What are the kinds of departments where, you found that, okay, this is the kind of place where my work can thrive, or place where I can really do the work that I want to do?
Yeah, and I mean, I will say this, that not all computer science departments are like that, but I will say that a lot of them are. So like, it's only when you're cued into like the hidden curriculum of academia do you really understand, or you have like mentors who can really cue you into that you know how to make the distinction. But as a critical scholar, I just wanted to be in a space that didn't expect the sort of same model of doing work as computer science traditionally is. And that I think was available in departments like information science or informatics, because it has a different lineage, I would say, from a computer science department. There are some information science departments that come from computer science departments. Cornell is one of them where I did my training. And those can be really interesting spaces to do that work because they have a really good relationship with computer science, and which is what I wanted as well. But it's hard to find some of these settings. But that's not to say that I know some of the other critical scholars who have applied to computer science, but the model of working is very much like a lab, and I don't do that kind of work. So I would say that figuring out what your model of work is and whether that fits into that department that you want to sort of be a part of is very critical to that. My work is very slow. It's very much based in like what I do as research. So it's collaborative, but it's very different in the sense that my dissertation project was almost all me. Like it wasn't like I was collaborating with sort of some students to do that. And that's, I think, the difference of figuring out what model you want to fit in. And another thing that I would say is that I think there are departments that they're new, that there are programs that are new, that are more interdisciplinary, that would be more open to doing different kinds of methods as well as sort of work in those settings. In fact, like Georgia Tech is a really interesting interactive computing department, which is a very separate one from like, even though it's traditionally computer science, it's not. It has a lot of people who don't do that kind of work. But one of the things that's not very obvious until you get into academia is sort of being trained into being a scholar and trying to be hired into academia is that what kind of publishing you do really determines the kind of settings you want to be in. So computer science has a very different model of publishing, and I did not think that I would fit into that model very easily. And so I wanted to have a space to have a different kind of a publishing model. And that meant that, I mean, I also got lucky that I was able to find a job like that. And I know not everybody gets a chance to do that. So how do you make the most of where you land is a different setting that one has to sort of, I mean, if there were times when I was in information science feeling like, oh, I wish I was in anthropology, or I wish I was in sociology, or I wish I was in media studies, and I would have like a very different set of courses I could do. But, like I was handed the hand, like, in the game of life, I was handed the hand of information science because that's what I knew and I made the most of it. And so I would just say that, finding your own voice is definitely a challenge in academia, especially in STEM as a minoritized scholar. But in that setting, it becomes even more to have like mentorship around that voice you want to preserve and sort of build. And yeah, like working towards that is I would say it's worth sort of investing in. And it might not lead to immediate success, but I think in the long term, it will make one happy. And that's very rare in academia. So I root for people's happiness and I want them to be happy. So yeah.
No, absolutely. And through this conversation, you've mentioned a few times that, mentorship and having somebody really root for you or kind of take you through that hidden curricula or really walk you through some of the things that you want to do. Have there been any people, or whether it's collectives or individuals, who have really influenced your journey or have really mentored you through all of these different turns that you've taken through your career?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course. Like, I think it's impossible to do any of this alone. And it's a myth that academia likes to create when we put our names on our dissertation. Like, it's really a myth. Like, it's not done by just one person. But I will say that I think choosing your committee wisely is one of the best decisions and most important decisions that one makes in entering at least an academic training setting, even at the master's level, I would say. And it might be a little less intense there, like the timing is a little less, but I do think it's very important. And it's hard to know that from the outside. So talk to the students of the mentors that you are going to work with, find them in confidence. I think that's one of the best ways to know whether a mentor is a good fit for the kind of work you want to do, for the kind of personality and philosophy you practice. And so that way, I think I got really, really lucky. And I think I chose well in terms of the committee I had. And But I will say that the committee is one part of the equation. There's like thinking about mentorship more as a broader circuit, because every person has like the more we kind of, get into a stage of capitalism where everything is like so busy, everybody has limited time, and that means that relying on just one or two people is just not going to work. So one of the things that I think I really benefited from was to find a community in in like peer scholars, and they were like in different settings. Some were in India, some were in the setting, some were in US, some were somewhere else, and really continuing to rely on each other for support and help and feedback. And I think I relied more on my colleagues than I did on necessarily teachers and mentors all the time. And for me, one of the very important characters that have helped me sort of find my voice is definitely Baba Saheb Ambedkar. And the reason is that I think the clarity of thought and the clarity of sort of holding your position, which what I've spoken about a little bit more before, is really hard to do in STEM, and it's really hard to do in sort of charting your own journey and charting your own way. And one of the things that I think I became very reliant on was seek out mentorship in his writings and his speeches, which a lot of people find surprising, because we always think about mentorship as somebody like living and somebody alive and things like that. But I will admit that I think there are very few people that I think are that I can look to and be like, oh, this is the kind of person that inspires the kind of work I want to do in STEM yet. I mean, there are some people who are doing really cool work, but at least in the spaces that I hang out in at computing, I felt like speaking truth to power was definitely something that was not normative. And so I had to find role models or mentorship in like scholars, in thinkers, and spending time with their writing to feel inspired was definitely one part of it. And lastly, I will say that critical scholars from like Black feminist and indigenous traditions, or really thinking with history around what is the history of my community, what is the history of where we come from, was another source of very big inspiration, and then also connection, right? Like we try to, when we learn about our roots, we kind of find other people who are also thinking about similar questions and seeking them out and like following them and reading their work and like sharing their work and thinking about it together has been very, very important to feel like I can be myself in these settings, not which is, see, still, I would say like at 80%, but whatever 80% has been achieved has been through a collective webbing of all of these different modes of engagement. And yeah, like writing has been really helpful also. And finding other people to look at your writing, look at what you're doing, and give you some kind feedback in addition to giving you critical feedback, which we get all the time in academia. So there's no dearth of that. Yeah, see, these have been sort of some settings where, and also like I know that, it's also not easy to find mentorship like that, but I think we're increasingly trying to build people who do have access to some of these spaces, including me, but also other scholars I know are trying to build networks like that. So seek us out, like, seek people out that even if you've read an article of theirs and you just like it, I would just like write to them. I think you will find that most people are, like more willing to hear and build connections on the basis of that than not. And all of us who are in these spaces from marginalized castes definitely know how lonely it can get. So like we want it to be less lonely, both for us, but also for others. So once you reach out to one of us, I think it's definitely going to make a difference, both for you as well as for us, to keep building that setting for each other. Yeah.
So I was going to ask something completely different, but based on like everything you've just said, and this is so crucial, right? Being able to find those spaces of belonging. And one hears way too often about people feeling isolated, whether it's at an undergrad level or whether it's at postgraduate or PhD or postdoc level, even to find those spaces where you can really belong, where you can really, like you said, speak truth to power and find those spaces where, you can really have that peer learning, like co-learning, healthy kind of environment. And two things that I wanted to get your thoughts on is one, of course, I've seen that, some of the work that you talked about, that you and other scholars are working on developing a network I've seen you do some of that very actively over the years, offering mentorship through Twitter, through social media platforms, through your networks. What has that experience been like for you? Because I know that mentorship is never really one way, right? It's always
Yeah,
like
of course.
two-way thing where you're both kind of learning off, from each other and
Yeah.
navigating different questions that may or may not be similar for each of your contexts. And secondly, like you mentioned that you have had networks here, whether it's in India or abroad, elsewhere through digital media. What has that network building really looked like? Have experiences of scholars been mostly similar across these contexts, or has it been different? Because another issue, I'm sorry, I'm adding like sub questions, but just like connected to this is the fact that you see so many people, especially women or students from minoritized castes, dropping out or falling through the cracks, like you talk about the leaky pipeline in academia. What have been some of the conversations or thoughts that have come around that, or has there been any organizing around it that has happened? Okay, I'm going to stop.
No, it's a great question. Both of them are great. I'll take the first one first, which is that actually they're related, I think, the first and the second question, because one of the things that, I mean, a part of my research is also looking at how framings around belonging in STEM are inflected by caste and who belongs in STEM and who doesn't. And so that aside, like, of course, when I mentor over the years, I have noticed that there's such a, like, the Brahminical university has such a big hold over sort of what legitimacy it gives to what kind of people, and it's really hard to break that as a mentor. As a mentor who wants to kind of wants the student to succeed, and that is obviously assuming you have a mentor who wants or understands that the university is a Brahminical institution, right? And so that's one part of it. And so over the years, one of the biggest challenges that I think our students face, these students from marginalized communities face, is just knowing language and knowing how to make what they know legible to academia. It's such a big gap, and it's very much a Brahminical project of, like, who has access to that kind of knowledge and who has access to that kind of language. Even in terms of, like, people who can speak English, it's not just English as a language that I'm talking about. It's about meaning making, as you were talking about, and how, what kind of words to use to make your work legible to what kind of communities, which is a really big part of academic research, is very, very, very inflected by caste and access to these spaces. And part of it is obviously the delegitimization of who belongs in the university, right? Like, people who are from certain, or the idea of merit sort of determining who gets to speak on behalf of whom and who gets to claim knowledge making as a project, and who gets to sort of just fit into it for the sake of getting degrees and getting sort of socioeconomic mobility. And so it has been really eye-opening, but also grounding for me to work with students to realize that a lot of knowledge exists that needs to be handheld to translation. And I know that my mentors did this for me, and I will continue to do that. And I know that a lot of mentors do that for others. But it's doubly sort of intense project with marginalized caste folks, because not only do you support, or you need to help them legitimize the work in terms of the oppressor's language or the Brahminical university, you need to sort of also help them feel legitimate in these spaces, which is a really big project and a very difficult project, I would say. And it's a lifelong project. Even I don't think I sort of feel that I have achieved it. And that being said, I have been thinking a lot about why do we use the language of leaky pipeline, and why do we sort of think about, which I know is the topic of, like, this podcast, thinking about women in STEM, or thinking about sort of marginalized identities in STEM as something that is a problem that needs to be solved. And increasingly, through my work and through sort of the experience of mentorship, I've realized that two things are happening. One is definitely a valorization of science and technology as a field, both in India, but also at the global level of like, and it ties really nicely into Brahminical sort of claims to the university, right? Because who are the members of the scientific and the technological community? It's mostly the upper castes, and they've had that space in the university for a very long time. But at the same time, this sort of valorization relies on devaluing of certain kinds of knowledges, right? And so inherently, the project of STEM as a STEM at the university level, but also STEM in general, is a sort of a meritocratic project that is reliant on materially sort of exploiting from labor that doesn't get legitimized as part of it. A very simple example of this that I think about a lot is that so that I keep thinking about how the question of fixing the leaky pipeline is actually the wrong question, because I think the question should be is that what does STEM in academia or STEM in general do for the most marginalized caste woman in the society, right? Like, what does it do for the woman who cleans the toilets of the universities that we're talking about, or the offices that we sort of sit in and practice these, or labs that we sort of inhabit? And does what she does count towards STEM, right? Like, and towards what we think of STEM as a project. So in my understanding, there is no ethical relationship possible with sort of the university in general, but in STEM especially. Like, as I speak that as somebody who has been part of STEM for a very long time, I know it's a relationship that benefits from exploitation, and I'm complicit in that. But at the same time, what I think about is the idea of thinking about the most marginalized caste women in tech in terms of work, like in material terms, is also, it also helps us think about why there is a leaky pipeline, right? Like, I think it shakes up this idea of like Brahminical patriarchy, which sustains STEM spaces. A lot of women drop out because of childcare, a lot of women drop out because of bias, and a lot of women sort of drop out because systemically they are not feeling like they can be a part of it, because it is a Brahminical institution designed for the Brahminical man, or designed for the Brahminical sort of privilege, but not just the Brahminical man, it's also designed for the Brahminical woman. So as we continue to think about stemming the gap, or stemming sort of some of these leaky pipelines, when you offer a very simple example of this is when you offer childcare services to a very accomplished woman scientist, and she's able to continue doing her job, what does she get paid versus the person who's taking care of her child, right? And what is like what is the contribution of the knowledge and how it is valued, right? So I think that the more I mentor and the more I'm in STEM and sort of kind of out of it also, I have like this unique position of sort of proximity and distance with it. I think STEM spaces continue to uphold the value of the value chain of this knowledge making, right? And which continues to delegitimize certain kinds of people and their access to these spaces. And people to fit into that, like even someone like me, I have to take the same route of like respectability and professionalization. But professionalization is Brahminical, right? Like, it's a project of Brahmanism. And so it's very hard to separate the two things, is what I'm trying to say. And the more I work with students who want to be part of these communities, the more I realize that it's a project that, yes, of course, I want to enable your access, but it's a project that needs to be dismantled from within, and we need to, it's sort of a double-edged sword of like wanting to enable access to marginalized communities, but to what end, I keep thinking, right? Like, when we come to these spaces, what are we trying to do? And a lot of us don't sort of always end up wanting to dismantle, because we get caught up in the respectability politics of sort of wanting to be part of these spaces. So that hasn't been, the second part of it hasn't been there, because I think a lot of our students are just even struggling to be a part of these spaces, to speak our mind, to just say our piece. But it's changing. I think like there are a lot of our people who are now graduating and graduated and are getting like public speaking sort of engagement. There are media creators. There are sort of people who are giving from our community, who are bringing other people and giving them space to give their ideas to the communities. But it's a longer project of really thinking about what science and tech makes possible and what it sort of diminishes, and what counts as science and tech and what doesn't. And I keep asking this question. My students get irritated a lot when I ask these questions all the time. But I think that is the central project that is very difficult to sort of achieve, but also very central to keep in mind while we're trying to enable access for a lot of other people. So access is just one part of the problem. And There was a very good interview. I don't know if folks have listened to it, if you've listened to it, by Rahul Sonpimple at this new podcast, that new episode by Anurag minus Varma's podcast. Please go listen to it if you haven't already listened to it. I think it's brilliant because it really it kind of goes deeper into this question that I was talking about in terms of like who benefits from sort of the kind of projects we undertake in terms of nation making. He talks a lot about like labor and things like that, but it's in the same vein of, inclusion to what end is the central thing that I am thinking about now, instead of just inclusion and maintaining the pipeline or sort of keeping the pipeline going, because the leaky pipeline is definitely it's a symptom of Brahminical patriarchy. The solution is not patching it, right? The solution, I think, is really dismantling and thinking about systemic reasons instead of sort of a band-aid approach to fixing the leaky pipeline. At least that's what I believe.
Absolutely. I think a transformative approach is extremely crucial, and the way you put it was really, really excellent, saying that fixing a leaky pipeline might take a more patchwork or band-aid approach, which again is to what end, right? Inclusion to what end? And that's some real food for thought here. But yeah, just wanting to follow up on the second question that
yeah. Sorry, I might have lost the
no.
because I wanted
No,
to
but
say
this is
yeah.
this is extreme. This is totally absolutely connected, right? Like I was asking about how is the situation or experience of students different across geographic
Oh
context,
yeah, right,
or
exactly.
is it similar? And one obviously very big, very long-term project that you've mentioned is the need to dismantle and completely transform the pipeline rather than just fix it. But what are like some of the say more immediate, no, I don't really like that word either, but like some of the ways that we can in fact work to retain more women and minoritized students in STEM?
So, I mean, I'll respond to the question of difference a little bit, and then I'll come to the next bit of like retaining minorities. One thing that I have definitely noticed in very limited, obviously, my exposure to Indian academia is very limited, I must admit. But I think whatever students I do speak to, I think the gatekeeping and gaslighting of marginalized caste students is very high in both settings. But there are systemic ways in which it's harder to navigate that in India than it is in, at least in my case, the US, because of the fact that it's very hard to sort of separate the university setting from sort of the larger geopolitical or the political climate, one. And then the second is harder to just engage or find options to really Brahminical models of mentoring and models of university control over what kind of research one produces and who produces it, And so the level of abuse in academia and overall is really high, but I do think that the kind of abuse that lower caste students face in India is very different from in the US, because just the contexts are so different. And so I do know for a fact that a lot of students in India are definitely inclined to drop out because they just feel like they're at a dead end. They just can't move past it. And this is not just true for like just women, but like marginalized caste students writ large. And this is true for like across STEM. And I think before the interview began, I was talking to you about this student that I was mentoring who was in computer science and was trying to sort of do her dissertation as a single mother and like against any kind of support. In fact, almost a lot of roadblocks from her own advisor. I think there were many multiple points of time when she was about to give up, and we had to sort of navigate the situation because she was also dealing with an abusive partner. And what in that moment became really clear was that just a one-time support was not going to be sort of enough, right? And she was not going to get it from the university. She was not going to get it from her mentor. So she needed sort of something outside. And so we started meeting more regularly, and I was trying to brainstorm with her. But there were certain material constraints that I couldn't resolve because I was at that time also pursuing my own PhD, and I couldn't resolve it. But I was like, okay, I have these connections that I can connect you to that are outside of the setting that you are in. But the meritocratic setup of some of the STEM settings is like there's very little patience to sort of help students who are not coming at the same from like an urban schooling environment or from a very fluent English speaking or very like, don't already have international education. You already know that, a lot of people are preferring to hire international PhDs or international degree holders over people from India. And that definitely makes a landscape for like so much more hostile for imagine it's already hostile for like Indian students. It makes it even more hostile for marginalized caste and marginalized sort of genders. And I would say that that is something that's very, very hard to navigate. And even as somebody who's trying to mentor her, I was at a loss of like, how do I go beyond this particular point, no matter what we did? And in that sense, the reason that I keep, and this ties into the sort of question you were asking later about how do we sort of fix the leaky pipeline around how do we help people stay in STEM. I just don't think that it's possible for the way STEM is right now to even sustain. Like, I think it's a lip service model of trying to be inclusive because the structures are definitely designed to prefer very, like very selective kind of students. Someone like me who's like foreign educated will find it very easy to sort of, and maybe like relatively less easier than maybe a upper caste scholar who's also same in a same setting. But even then, like these markers are just very solidified at this point. So one of the ways in which I keep thinking about this question of the leaky pipeline is that the practice that the university needs to open up to thinking about research beyond what they already know, right? And what the candidates they already are. Like they need to be really thinking about what are we making possible, like what is the kind of knowledge we are creating. And I really honestly believe that the knowledge we're creating is becoming even more mediocre because of the fact that we're just the same kind of people are producing the kind of knowledge we've always been having, because the gates have become even taller and taller to cross. And so my assessment and my recommendation in this setting is to distribute your resources, open up these spaces in ways that you don't think are like, in line with what we've always done before. There was actually a moment when I was in the hiring setting at Cornell, PhD hiring, and there was a student who didn't have any research background who had applied to a PhD, but they had a lot of experience, like real world experience in the field that they did. It was learning analytics related stuff. So they wanted to do data science stuff in university learning and assessment settings. So they had worked in that industry for close to 5 years and had a lot of real life experience. But when we was debating who to admit to the program, it always kept coming like, this person doesn't have any research experience. And I was like, okay, this person doesn't have any research experience, but you want to hire people from different backgrounds, but you're using the same criteria to hire the people in the department and keep saying that you want to hire from a different background. It's not going to happen until you completely leave all the background things, all the sort of, criteria that you have had before aside and start from scratch. Like that is the only way we can actually make or overhaul the system a little bit in whatever way possible. And that I think is very hard to convince. And it's harder to sort of convince. It's not just India. I think it's also hard to convince people in that setting. I was able to speak that up because I was like, oh, I mean, I have nothing to lose. I'm already in this program. And like none of the people who were saying these things were my mentors. And then I had somebody else back me up when I said something like this. So I do think that, and this person who backed me up was a white person, right? So like those kind of dynamics work better in the US because you have certain strategic mobilities that you don't have to necessarily deal with the same people who block access to your things. But the same problem I'm sure exists in India, and like scholarships are diminishing, and all the people who could be in academia are going to find it harder and harder to be in academia because the models, and obviously academia in general is under attack, but even within that, I think people are trying to hold on to sort of there's ways we know already to sort of sustain. And then they say that they want to make something diverse. It just doesn't make sense to me. So to me, that is actually an elite capture of the project of reimagining the university, right? Like it just does the sort of lip service that we all know needs to be done in the current political climate, but it doesn't actually materially change anything for anybody from the actual marginalized locations. And I don't think that this is going to be possible until people who have a say in the room are actually understanding what is at stake when we continue to do what we're doing. So I'll pause there, but I think that that's my biggest complaint. I don't know if that actually answered your question, but I do think that that is my biggest complaint in terms of even the patchwork of the pipeline.
Yes, you're absolutely right. It's true. I mean, we can't have the same criteria and say that, oh, we want to hire, a diverse candidate from a more diverse candidate pool. And I'm like, you can't do that. You're absolutely right. You can't do that if you keep that same criteria. And if you want people with different backgrounds, experiences, and whatnot, like you have to open up those criteria. And that is so important to do. But yes, many, many complaints, and I completely agree with what you've said.
And
And
that's why I was saying that there is no ethical relationship possible with the
there
university.
isn't.
There's only an exploit. Like we as marginalized people have to become sort of subversive in our modes of access. And the only way to make that happen, a lot of people sort of complain around. One of my favorite examples around this is, how women are always asked to do more service work in academia and in STEM spaces. And I love it when women deny to do any of these roles, because I think there is no way for you to sort of do this work and feel at least part of, do this work as part of your official job and there's this brilliant book by Elizabeth Polinelli called The Cunning of Recognition, which I think is really brilliant for the fact that she talks about how recognizing something sometimes can become a way of exploiting that very thing from the structures of power. And I think that is what happens when women sort of agree to do service roles in these settings and not in other settings. So like when I do service, I'm like, I'm going to do this outside of my work, and this is the setting I'm going to do it in, so that I don't get like I get to decide what this becomes instead of them sort of having a say. And so this refusal of doing things that the university or the setup that you're in asks you to do and expects you to do is a very powerful form of sort of denying it the power that it has and continuing the sort of perpetuation of like throwing you out of the pipeline, not just like letting it leak, but literally throwing you out. And so it's really great when women just deny to do service roles or just be like, I'm not available, I'm just not going to be able to do this, and they get vilified for it. But it's increasingly important for, I think, us to realize that vilification of people who deny to do certain things that they're expected to do is just something that needs to be dismantled. So every time, I know that when I talk to my colleagues who are postdocs in like STEM labs, when they say like, it's so difficult for me as students to take me seriously, or when, like a marginalized caste student says like, it's so difficult for my mentor just doesn't take me seriously. Sometimes I just tell them, find somebody else who takes you seriously and go through that route, because it's just not worth it sometimes to sort of go through that setting. And I'm not trying to sound entrepreneurial. I know that these ideas sound like, oh, let's do something to fix it, and we can just do everything to fix it ourselves. But in terms of survival, I do think that the leaky pipeline is not really a leaky pipeline as much as it is a pipeline meant to keep some people and throw other people out. So I think that once you realize where are the turns of throwing people out, and really using that to hold the systems that you're in accountable and holding mentors you're in accountable. I was reading today about how the SC/ST atrocity acts are just not leading to the convictions that they need to be leading to. Like the conviction rate is just so low. And so that doesn't inspire any confidence from any sort of marginalized caste person to even stand up against the structures of power that are sort of trying to push them down, right? So it's not a leaky pipeline, it's a pipeline meant to throw out certain people from academia and some of these spaces. And that continues to be true for like so many other people. So how do you there is no way to sort of be ethical in this space and get what you need to do. You need to be unethical to be successful in these spaces. And by unethical, I mean unethical to the Brahminical system, Brahminical patriarchy. And that means denying and refusing and subverting so many things to be able to survive it. And I know a lot of people feel really uncomfortable when I say something like that, but I definitely believe that's the only way to survive and sort of get what you want from this.
Of course, most truths when spoken, people do feel uncomfortable. And of course, you've spoken about like denial, and this is something also that we hear so much about, right? Like, okay, so few women in STEM, or so few people from marginalized backgrounds in STEM, inundated with mentorship requests or service requests, or being asked to do way more than what they are supposed to be doing in terms of their work. what have been some of the questions that you've gotten from students or potential students who want to join STEM or take their career forward in STEM? And secondly, because of the fact that, of course, I know you and I'm sure many other people are inundated with such requests, what role might say something like a digital mentorship model where there is some sort of digital one-to-one or some sort of social media outreach or something, building resources, like you said, you're working on building a web resource or something like this podcast do in that kind of situation to kind of offer at least like that first step guidance?
Yeah, I think I have benefited a lot from digital networks because, of course, as I mentioned, I think I was definitely very much the only person in my department in the settings I was working in. So I benefited a lot by finding other people who I think would get it, would I could learn from, who I also read, the people reach out to me once they read my work, and I make it a point to at least connect with them, even if I can't always fulfill all the requests that people might have. I at least respond to let them know that, like, it's okay to reach out to people because I know that there's a lot of hesitation also. Definitely marginalized caste students I know feel a lot of hesitation in reaching, like doing cold emailing and cold. And there's sometimes the questions are very simple, like, how do you even cold email somebody? And that's the moment when you also realize how much of a hidden curriculum some of these elite spaces sort of internalize in you. When you get questions like, oh, okay, like, what kind of email do I write, or like, what is it okay to sort of just reach out to somebody like that? And to me, that's such a eye-opening moment for two reasons. One is obviously how inaccessible these spaces seem to so many people, right? And how inaccessible I might seem to someone when they are writing to me, and I don't want to, but there's somehow this idea that, that the value chain, again, the value chain of knowledge, who gets to sort of demand something off of, and has a right to demand your time versus not. I do not see upper caste students hesitating to reach out to me at all, ever. Like, I feel like they feel like they are entitled for an answer. That's also somehow sometimes how they reach out to me. That's a very different point, but that's sort of the difference that I notice. And the second way in which it is eye-opening is that I think what I realize in these moments is how the work of the digital sort of realm is to help ease some of these settings, right? So there's this really cool work that's being done by Collaborative Action for Research and Education, which is just like so CARE is the short form, run by two really, really cool people that I know, that's trying to sort of make some of these hidden curriculum things accessible to students. You can find them on Twitter as care_educate. I think that's their handle. And what I liked about that model was that they upload a lot of the things that, like, they do these webinars with people in the universities, and it's something as simple as, like, how do you write your statement of purpose, or how do you sort of write an interdisciplinary sort of project, how do you write an email to somebody, but they upload all of these things somewhere online, so that, and that makes also my life easier, because once I have that there and somebody reaches out to me with that request, I have a set of resources that I can kind of point. So that's brilliant. But that's one way I think the digital setting also help keep, it maintains an archive of some sort of some of these things. To your second question, like, indeed, like, more things that I've been thinking about is the digital realm is also really good for marginalized caste students to really have a sense of, or keep tabs on what's happening from a marginalized caste perspective. If you follow some of these Instagram and Twitter and some of these handles, I know they're hard to discover and they have their own bubbles, but once you do find them, it's really good, because then you are engaging with the critical caste perspective on a daily basis through the content you're consuming. And that is very rare for a lot of students because, like, if you're isolated, especially in STEM settings, a lot of people don't want to sort of be identified as marginalized caste for reasons related to sort of questioning around their merit, right? And so these kind of settings make it really helpful for people to build their caste consciousness semi-anonymously, or sort of in a under the radar sort of a fashion. But I think that these silos are very hard to break. So that is one really big shortcoming. And of course, it's designed to be that way, right? Like the monopolies of the big tech are designed to sort of keep you in your silos because that's what's profitable. To stereotype and sort of boxes is the most profitable way for companies to make the money that they make through social media. And breaking out of like linguistic barriers is very difficult. So as every time I recently did a workshop which was both in Hindi and English, and the way that we did that workshop was I was so at the end of it I was so upset, and I spoke about it very passionately, being like, we can't think of translation as something that is an afterthought, right? Like it's not something like there was somebody who was translating real time with us. But even then, I could, when it was on Zoom, so I could switch between the English and what was on Zoom called the Chinese channel because there was no Hindi channel apparently. So as soon as I queued into the Chinese channel to hear the Hindi version, I could see the world of a difference of like how the content itself is changing in terms of accessibility. And that really gave me pause to think about how much of the world that we think is like being radicalized through anti-caste thought is inaccessible to so many people. And so even though digital spaces make certain things possible, which I have definitely benefited a lot from, every time I talk to somebody who doesn't have the same sort of English literacy, or even my parents, I talk to my parents and I realize that, like they don't have access to these things. And how do I make it possible when they're not native internet users? They're not native, English speakers. It continues to sort of baffle me how exclusive and how excluding the digital realm is to some of these settings. So the real challenge is to sort of be able to cross the barrier, and that's a whole different project in itself, which I've become recently very aware of and I want to work towards. But again, like there's so much to do. So yeah, anyway, that would be one of the ways. At least that's kind of my impression of how some of these settings are happening. I'm also trying to learn how to translate the writing I do in other settings, which I know you've been working on a little bit as well with Fem Positive. I remember in the past you've done that. And I every time I read Khabar Lahariya or I think about Mook Nayak and a bunch of other these publications, I keep thinking about, oh, how I need to write a piece in one language and then get it translated. Every time I write something, I need to get it translated. So how do I find the resources to do that, But those are thoughts that are not something we are incentivized to think about. We're incentivized to talk in English. We're incentivized to write in English. We're incentivized to, keep continuing building the digital realm in a particular language for a particular set of people and not cross that barrier or like bring those two silos together or break the silo. So that's the challenge that I don't think I've figured out the answer to. And I'm happy to sort of think and work and build with people around that.
Yes, I think here when there are so many languages, right? It's not just
Exactly.
translating from one language to another, it's across so many languages, across so many different scripts that not all of us may be fluent in. How do we do that? How do we make things accessible? How do we make information more legible as well? Like you've said,
Yeah.
knowing that
Yeah.
language is also so important. And if you don't, then even if there are resources, they might just be like completely illegible, that okay, I don't understand what is written here. Like, okay, this might be helpful for doing XYZ things, but I don't understand how to do the ABC to reach the XYZ.
Yeah.
So yeah, bridging those gaps, I think what you've said is extremely important, and there is a lot of work still to be done with, even with any form of, even if it's just building digital resources, like making even those more robust is extremely important. You've mentioned so many different kinds of basic to extremely challenging questions that you've gotten from students who have reached out to you, people who have reached out to you. Is there any, I know there's no one thing that you can say to really fuel passion and success in somebody, but are there any general pieces of advice that you usually share with students who reach out to you?
I think one of the consistent themes that I forgot to mention this before, but the consistent theme of gaslighting continues to appear across many kinds of students that reach out to me. It's not just limited to marginalized, but sometimes even like Muslim or marginalized religion students reaching out to me. And one thing that continues to remain a theme across those things is feeling like what you're feeling is not legitimate, right? And I think that one of the ways that at least one thing, if anybody takes away anything from the podcast, this is just one that I would like to convey is that if somebody is denying how you're feeling, that should be the biggest red flag ever for anything that you're doing. And I know that it's very hard to remember that, right? And I think that I have struggled to remember that in many settings. And denying your instinct, denying what you as somebody who is aware and critically engaged with settings, that building your own critical consciousness is the biggest investment you can make for your career, even in STEM, and especially in STEM, I would say. So and it begins from like really noting, and critical consciousness begins from noting how moments of cognitive dissonance are happening, right? Like when you feel like you did all you could, but you still didn't get that promotion, or you did all you could and you didn't get the accolade you deserved for it, or when you decided to pursue a particular topic because you knew you had the right reasons. A very simple example of this was me when I started pursuing my research on caste and tech. I had so many Savarna scholars reach out to me, or like, when I would meet them and I tell them that I'm working on this, they would be like, why are you working on this? Work on platform labor, or like work on as if platform labor has nothing to do with caste and tech, is how they would pose it. But like they would be like, oh, are you sure you want to do this? Because it's going to be so difficult and it's going to be so hard. And I think that every time I encountered that question, it made me like I started approaching that itself as field work. And that's, I think, a very interesting approach to take that comes from obviously a very blessed approach of humanities and social sciences. But for people who don't even have exposure to that, thinking about your lab as a social setting that is inflected by the dynamics that shape our society, and reflecting on how experiences in your lab or experiences in your university, in your classroom, are also inflected by the larger forces of the society, and just pausing to think about that, it will give you strength, because once you distance yourself from the experience you're having and think about what is happening to you and why it might be connected to the larger source forces of Brahminical society that we all exist in India, it will really open your eyes up to how you might be implicated in these settings beyond your control. So then that really frees you up from thinking it's your fault and it's your sort of shortcoming only that's stopping you from achieving what you need to achieve. And that to me has been one of the ways in which I think critical education in the STEM is really important. And I think I continue to sort of want to hang out with STEM spaces, even though I could very easily not be in those spaces. But one of the projects that I think I have and I want to continue encouraging other STEM folks to have is that we don't need to choose between critical thinking and critical consciousness and doing a more STEM approach. I think we need to bring them together every day. And what that looks like is being able to question your own norms and assumptions and settings. And that will bring immense power to you, I think. And it has to me. And I think it will bring power to whoever is trying to do this if they're from a marginalized location. It's not denying how you're feeling, but trying to find people who can help you affirm it. So if your colleagues don't get it, if your mentor doesn't get it, find somebody who gets it. Like, I think that's the number one step. And if you can't find somebody in real life, find somebody online. I think that's one of the ways in which the world is opening up. And if you can't find somebody who gets it in your language, find it, like, find a way to translate it. Pull somebody in and be like, I want to translate this thing. I want to put it in an email and send it. But having a space of your own, having a mind of your own, having a setting of your own where you can separate what is happening to you from um from what you are doing, and like how external factors are shaping what's happening in your life, I think will really change how much power you think you have in a setting, and how much power it draws from you, right? Like how much it takes away from you. So even I hang out with a lot of women in STEM groups actually because of my research. And one of the things that I find really interesting in there is that there's this huge push for making your learn, like, a hurt or some experience you've had productive. What I mean by that is that, if you experience bias in the workplace as a woman, or you experienced some sort of even sexual harassment, like, I think a lot of people even in STEM support groups, tend to focus on, oh, okay, now what do we do? How do we solve this sort of situation? Or like, you experienced it, it was legitimate and it's real, but how can you make, something like this a source of power? I think that's really harmful because it doesn't let you sort of sit with what has just happened to you. But one of the other things that happens in these groups is that a lot of these sessions are just about bonding over what has happened. And a lot of the spin that some of the groups want to give is in the name of positivity. But at the end of the day, when they go into breakout rooms, or everybody that goes into the breakout rooms is just sharing what happened and, helping each other see each other's perspective in a way and affirming each other. I think that is the most important thing. Whether we are able to solve it, we can never solve anything at the individual level anyway. So, like, I think that finding a group that lets you have a space to affirm the experiences you've had and what you're feeling is the most important thing, instead of trying to jump into solving mode and, like, quick fixing whatever has happened to you and denying it. So the power of collectivizing and the power of sort of political awareness, I cannot be overstated, I would say. But I know it's not accessible to everybody at all times. So I mean, I hope we can create more spaces like that. And I'm glad that you invited me to be a part of this so that I can maybe hopefully radicalize some people to break everything down and start from scratch. But I know it's easier said than done. So we have to start from where we are. And starting from where we are is easier when we have other people who can affirm our experiences, I would say.
Thank you for sharing all of these experiences and insights and learnings and advice. My last question to you is, now where you are, right, doing your postdoc, I think you're doing your fieldwork right now in India for it, turning your dissertation into a book. Very excited about that. What are some of your what are some of your goals, aspirations, next steps now in your life, career, and yeah, if you have any final thoughts.
I think increasingly I'm becoming more interested in breaking down the walls of STEM spaces, academic spaces. And so what that looks like for me is a lot more community engagement. Even more, I mean, I've definitely been more community engaged in my work always, but finding ways to sort of move spaces, resources in service of the communities that I work with, and whose work I think is going to help dismantle structures of status quo that we are all having to cope with, is one of the biggest goals I have. And like whatever I do next is going to be in that direction. The book is definitely one part of the story, because I think, like, in my pursuit of dismantling the castelessness of the computing industry, I also want to tell a different story about what computing is in India and what computing means for India at the global sort of landscape, and how caste sort of enables the kind of story it wants to tell about itself. And so a lot of what I see coming for myself is also changing the terms of engagement and terms of storytelling around STEM spaces, and especially computing in India, which I think is very much saturated with one kind of narrative. And a lot of it has to obviously coming from like mobilization of anti-caste sort of groups, but also in the US, some of them are in the US, but a lot of them is to connect the questions of labor that I raised in the sort of university to the questions of labor at computing in the global scale, both in industry as well as the state level settings. And continuing to, as you put it, create accessibility to the spaces that I have sort of access to for other marginalized students has been a project that I've been working on for a very long time, in whatever limited capacity that an individual can do. But hopefully, with now having finished the PhD, like now having sort of access to more communities and more resources, being able to sort of direct them to the communities that and bring in people in the academy who are able to sort of tell stories and speak truth to power that I will never be able to, because I come from a very specific community, right? So, and that doesn't have to be just marginalized caste people, but also because I'm located in an international setting, like translating across contexts of what does an anti-caste movement mean to the anti-imperial, anti-colonial project in STEM globally and vice versa. Like, what can we learn from others? So that's kind of the broad, very ambitious and very broad goals that I am working on, but trying to concretize them as much as I can. Working with marginalized caste students has been something that I've been doing, and I'm trying to build more and more like writing and research capacity and helping them apply to places that they want to sort of be in and create alternative forms of knowledge. The next project that I want to do is is going to be, I have not invested that much in educating upper caste and Brahminical sort of settings around caste. I want to, but I also feel like I don't want to do it alone. So I'm trying to find co-conspirators. And so once I do, I think, yeah, I would love to work with you to do that. So that's another sort of goal. It's just a goal that I don't want to sort of pursue solely. I want to be able to find space because it can be very draining as a marginalized caste student to just keep working in these spaces. So like I want to find spaces of nourishment that feed into that kind of work. But yeah, that's sort of in a nutshell. Mostly I'm trying to write every single day, like every other academic, and failing at it almost every day. And then some days I succeed. So yeah, hopefully I am able to sort of keep up with whatever big goals I've just mentioned. But every day, just sort of finding small corners of intervention that feel sustainable and feel doable, and really actually just dismantling STEM. Like that's been my thing. Like just because I have been in it, and I think I feel confident in seeing things some in ways that I don't think a lot of people can, because of the fact that just the familiarity of training in those disciplines and training in those settings gives you. So I want to be able to use that privilege to the sort of project of dismantling the value chain of STEM and what counts as, and just like the Brahminical setup of it. Yeah.
Wonderful. Do you have any final thoughts to share? Anything we didn't really touch upon, but you wanted to share?
Uh, I don't think so. I think I spoke everything that I wanted to. And I am very excited that you let me come and be like, no, I don't want to just talk about this one particular way of stemming the gap. And you were I'm really grateful that you were very enthusiastic and supportive of that.
Because there is no one way, right? Like,
Oh,
as
yeah, yeah, yeah. But like I feel like I keep encountering that all the time. So I'm glad that you were very open to that. And I think that's what we need. So thank you. I don't have any more thoughts. I'm thought out totally.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Very, very excited to see what you do next and keep learning from your work. And
Yeah, same here. And I mean, thank you for having me. And I'm really excited for hearing other people's perspectives who you're going to interview, and also learning more about some of the projects that you mentioned. So I can't wait to dig in and learn from you all in this project. Thank you for having me.
thank you for listening to this podcast. At STEM the Gap, our goal is to bridge the gender imbalances in STEM through multidisciplinary research, policy, and practice. If you enjoyed listening to this conversation, then please like, share, and subscribe to our channel and stay connected with us through our website and social media pages. Links in description.